It's becoming common for people to look at a child or an adult with a physical deformity and feel that abortion would have been a more humane option for them, as they now have to live their life with what can sometimes be a profound disability. But what do you say to someone whose physical deformity is as a result of an abortion attempt on their life? Josiah Presley is here today to talk about his story and life as an abortion survivor. Welcome, Josiah. Thank you for being here and being a part of our Survivors Project. Can you share your story with us?
Yeah, so I am originally from South Korea. I grew up in the United States, so I was adopted when I was 13 months old. I grew up in the state of Oklahoma. It's right above Texas. So if a lot of people are watching this who aren't necessarily from the States, nobody knows where Oklahoma is, but everybody knows where Texas is. So I grew up in the state right above Texas. I grew up the son of a pastor of worship. That's what my father did for a living. He was a pastor at a church, and so I grew up in a very pro-life church. Uh, our church kind of lived out their pro-life convictions in that they adopted. So there's a lot of adopted kids in my church. Actually, I'm actually one of 12 kids. 10 of us are adopted, and so that's one of the main ways that my parents lived out their pro-life convictions. They adopted children. So I grew up with these convictions, grew up in the church, very just strong Christian beliefs in a pro-life perspective of the world. For the most part, though, that didn't really matter too much to me for most of my childhood, actually. It's something I knew, it's something I understood, but it wasn't something that really affected my life that greatly. When it started to affect my life, when I started to care about the issue, was when I was 13 years old. At the age of 13, my adopted parents, they thought I was old enough to know more about my adoption story and kind of my origin story in South Korea. And they told me about how my birth mother actually had a curettage abortion 2 months into her pregnancy with me. She thought everything had gone successfully. The doctor sent her home, but a few months later, she actually realized that the abortion had failed. At that point, I was kept, and I was born later on October 7th, 1995. I lived with the foster home or a foster family for about a year before I was adopted and brought over to the States and made part of the Presley family. So at the age of 13, I went from a kid who knew we were pro-life, knew why we were pro-life, based in our Christian convictions, the belief that abortion is a taking of innocent human life, the understanding that human life is valuable because humans are created in the image of God. And so because that inherently we ought to protect and care for human life. So having all those convictions, not really caring about those convictions, to all of a sudden I started to care about the issue of what it meant to be pro-life, because all of a sudden this was an issue that was front and center for me. There was no escaping it. It was weaved into my story because, in fact, my story was supposed to have not started because of this issue. So at the age of 13, I really started to care about it, but not in a very good way, not in a proper way or a healthy way. I was filled with a lot of anger. I was filled with a lot of anger towards my birth parents. Um, the fact that they would try to take my life, why would they do something like that to me? I have a deformed arm. You can see if I put my hands up here in the video. Uh, Potentially due to the abortion, it's a likely consequence of the abortion. And so in my mind as a 13-year-old, I had a deformed arm because of decisions they made. And so there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of hatred towards them for the decisions that they make. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of depression that came with it. Just as a kid, I had struggled with self-image issues, self-value, just because of my deformity. And so at that point in my life, while there's anger and hatred towards my birth parents, there's also, for me, there was proof that my life was invaluable. Because after all, the people who should have loved me the most saw my life was so invaluable, they tried to take it. So there's a lot of just hurt there, a lot of depression and just self-image issues, self-value issues. Like, hey, well, they don't care about me. If my own flesh and blood didn't care about my life, why would I think my life is valuable? And so there's a lot of just anger, hatred, hurt there. In the report that we received, it mentioned, it said that due to financial difficulties, they had chosen to have the abortion. But all those things, I really didn't care about that at the time because I was just blinded by my anger and my hurt and my hatred. And that's something I really struggled with for a few years. And so I went from knowing why we were pro-life to not really caring why we were pro-life because it didn't affect me to all of a sudden it affected me. It was right there in front of my face. I couldn't avoid it. And I was just filled with anger and hatred over it. And that's something I struggled with for a few years. Really, the change, though, that occurred in my life happened the summer after my sophomore year of high school. I was at church camp. So at a young age, I professed faith in Jesus. But that's something that I really didn't understand at the time. And it was something I think the Lord really was working through my life. But the summer after my sophomore year of high school, we were at summer camp. We were at church camp. And I remember the preacher that week, he kept talking about this Greek word dunamis and how it means power. And he talked about how as believers, Christ, God imparts to us his power through Christ to go through the trials of this world, to go through the difficulties of the world, and to overcome it, to overcome sin, to overcome temptation, to overcome trials and different things like that because of the power that's within us. That's God has worked through us through Christ, right? And this reality that we overcome. Now, I remember in high school just thinking, man, I don't have that kind of power in my life because I am this broken down, hurting, angry person. On the outside, I did all the good things. I did all the right things. I found identity. I found value. I found worth in being the good Christian kid. That's kind of the image I pursued, being that good Christian kid. And so I did all these right things, but in reality, I did them all because I liked the way it made me look. I liked the front it put up for others to see, not because of a change that actually occurred in my life. And so I remember the Thursday night of that camp, turning my life over to Christ, recognizing that I was a sinner who needed to be forgiven, recognizing that I needed to find my value, my purpose, my identity in Christ, who he is, not in myself, not in the things I've done, but in what he has done. And so as I turned my life over to Christ and his lordship, the Lord really then began to work and change my heart on the issue, right? So I had gone from being pro-life, knowing why I was pro-life, not caring about why I was pro-life, to all of a sudden caring because of my story, but not caring in a good way or a proper way because I was blinded by anger and hatred, to all of a sudden now redeemed by the blood of Christ, recognizing my value, my purpose in Christ, but also recognizing truly the value and the purpose of every human being because they're created in the image of God. All right. And we come back full circle on this. And so now I'm starting to understand this reality that my life's valuable. Not only is my life valuable, but everybody's life is valuable. The unborn child's life is valuable. But not only is their life valuable, but even the people on the other side of the arc, their life is valuable. My birth parents, their lives are valuable. The Planned Parenthood, the abortion doctors and pro-choice people, their lives are valuable because they're human beings created in the image of God. And as the Lord worked that out in my life, he really started to then, I believe, mold me more into his image, into something that could be used. In the Bible, James tells us that pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to care for the orphan and widow in their affliction. Proverbs 31 tells us to speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves, for the rights of all who are poor and destitute. And so kind of as these scriptures work themselves out in my life, it then started to move me as Christ was working in my life. It moved me into a position of being like, okay, so I recognize my beliefs, why the human life's valuable, and I care about this issue. And so this is something I'm going to then start giving to the Lord and allowing him to use in order to hopefully save lives and see lives change. And so that started me on a trajectory. When I was 16, I really kind of didn't launch into pro-life work on much of a scale until my senior year of high school, kind of working my way into that. It's actually, it's really cool to be on this call with you. So my first major speaking engagement I ever did was actually getting to come to Dublin to speak at y'all's
It was the
y'all's conference. And so,
Irish Convention for Life, I think, or the National Convention for
yeah,
Life. Yeah.
yes,
Hmm.
yeah, that's really kind of what a big the major event that really kind of started me into speaking and being involved kind of on a larger scale. But that's really, I think, what the Lord used, um, and how He worked it out in my life. And it's still things I'm struggling with. I'm working through. There's different parts to it for sure, but it's really great to see His goodness in it. But then also the fact that He's got purpose for my life, but He's got purpose for everyone's life. And we're called to care for others. We're called to love others. We're called to speak up for others. And so that's just kind of my goal and what I'm trying to do with my life. And so that's kind of my story in a gist.
Well, that's amazing. One of the things that you said that really struck with me was that sort of a factor that played a big role in your mother deciding, your biological mother deciding to have an abortion, were financial difficulties, which is so tragic for so many reasons, but also because we know that that is a situation so many pregnant women have found themselves in and are finding themselves in to this day. But financial difficulties are not written in stone. They do not have to be permanent, and they can be alleviated. If somebody was threatening to commit suicide due to financial difficulties, we would say those exact things to them. We would not, support their right to kill themselves, no matter how much they insisted it was the answer to their problems, because we know that that is not a reason to end human life, but for some reason that doesn't extend to our unborn sons and daughters. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so here in the States, a big push for it right now, a big call for the right to abortion is, kind of this woman's rights and their ability to be able to pursue life, and like the difficulties it'll place on their life. And I think we can't ignore the fact that they're very difficult situations in which pregnancies occur. I mean, we would be blind to say that raising children isn't difficult, right? There is obviously great difficulties, great joys, and great reasons to, but there's also great difficulties in raising children, having children, and raising them. We can't deny that fact. But when we consider the answer that's given to abortion, that's really not a helpful or a good response. I mean, in no other scenario, and no other difficult situation, like you said, would we say, oh, the answer is to take a life. Yet in reality, here in the States, that's the easy response. And they act like that's the helpful response. But I mean, if we really think about it, like, hey, you are in this difficult situation. Hey, instead of actually helping you through this situation by providing resources, by providing financial assistance or different things like that, here's the option we're going to give to you. Why don't you go take a life? As if that is an actual helpful thing that's really going to help women. And one thing I've seen, just in the ministry I've done and the work I've done, I can't tell you how many countless stories I've heard of women who have bought that lie, who had the abortion, and who decades later are still paying the consequences for that decision, physically and emotionally and spiritually. And yet that's the lie that we sell to them. And it's really dangerous.
No, it is. And, you're exactly right. I mean, the same pro-choice politicians and abortion supporters who would feign compassion for a struggling pregnant woman by offering her a free abortion or supporting the idea of a free abortion would do very little or nothing to help the same struggling pregnant woman who wants to keep her baby. It's like a culture of death. It's just horrible. Yeah. And one of the things as well that you mentioned was that, understandably, a lot of emotional pain and suffering came with the knowledge that you were an abortion survivor. But thankfully, you overcame that. But there are still a lot of abortion supporters who would say that it is better for a baby to be aborted than to be born just to be placed into foster care, where they will have to grow up and likely struggle a lot with feelings of being unwanted or unloved. What would you say to that? And like, how do you deal with the idea that some people think they know what would have been better for you?
Yeah. So first I would say to that, so I'm an adopted kid, right? So I grew up, my parents, I've got Caucasian American parents. But I never, and I know this isn't the case for everybody, but I can say personally for me, I never felt like lesser their son or lesser wanted by them. Um, I felt that towards my birth parents, but never towards my adopted parents. If anything, actually, the news of this reality drove me more towards my adoptive parents. Just seeing their care and their love for me. Uh, growing up, so I'm Asian, got Asian features, all that sort of stuff, right? My parents are Caucasian American. It was never a question whether or not I was adopted, right? It's not like I had to one day go, "Hey, mom, dad, do you think I'm adopted?" Right? Like we were very familiar, like all throughout my childhood, everybody could tell, like I'm obviously adopted. Um, but I never felt alienation because of that. Now, I'm not saying that's the case for anybody, but I think for everybody, I mean, but for the vast majority, I think really there's a lot of love and care that's really proven through adoption and fostering and shown through that, to really affirm people and their value. Okay, so anecdotally, that's what I've experienced, and that's what I believe to be true. But we set that aside. So let's say, because obviously there are instances where people are still marginalized because of that. They face difficulties, whether it be because they're not placed in a good situation, or just even their own battles that they have to face. Because every child who's adopted, they have to face this reality of the fact that they've been rejected by somebody, right? They've been rejected by somebody on a level that a lot of people don't necessarily experience, especially at the age that they've experienced it. They've been adopted as a young child, right? Because regardless of the circumstances, as an adopted child, at some point in your life, you have to face the reality that at one point in time, your own flesh and blood, whether because they didn't want you or couldn't take care of you, they gave you away. That's a reality that every adopted kid has to face at some point in their life, whether it's just for a short moment of recognizing that and moving on, or it's a long drawn out process. Like I said, I have 10 adopted siblings. I've seen it take many different forms as they've processed through that throughout my childhood. But that still doesn't mean that the better response is to take their life, right? To say, hey, this person's going to have hardships, this person's going to have difficulties. And so because of that, it's okay to take their life. Especially because we go, okay, so where do we draw that line, and how do we even draw that line?
Exactly.
Right? You can't draw that line, because it's a subjective line at that point to say, okay, somebody's right to live determines upon the quality of life they're going to have. Where do you draw that line on what is considered quality of life? You can't. It's completely subjective. But even more so, their quality of life does not determine their value as a human being. My quality of life and my abilities does not determine whether or not I'm a human being who should be protected and cared for by other human beings, right? Um, and we would say that as a Christian, I would say that because I believe human beings are created in the image of God, and because they're created in the image of God, they inherently, because they are human beings, they are valuable, and they ought to be protected. They ought to be cared for, right? But even from a non-Christian worldview, we see all the time people understand this reality that we ought to care for human beings, and that human life is valuable, right? We see that in our culture all over the place. So we would at least say that. Now, do they live that out? Obviously not, because we live in a culture that abortion is a reality, a very harsh and true reality. But it doesn't change the fact, circumstances, difficulties of life that they may have, it doesn't change the fact that they are a human being, that their life is valuable and it ought to be cared for, right? Again, the response isn't to take the life, right? We don't say that's okay in any other instances.
Totally correct. And another thing that you said back at the National Convention for Life here in Ireland in 2014 was that my parents loved me and adopted me in spite of my physical disabilities, which is beautiful. And while you're pretty sure that the damage to your arm is due to the abortion attempt, it's worth highlighting that, as I'm sure you know, a tragic number of abortions happen every single year because of a presumed disability of the babies, which is sick. It implies this sort of supremacist belief that if you don't meet some arbitrary standard of perfect human, you don't deserve to live. You know, due to circumstances outside of the baby's control, the baby must die. It's horrific, and to me, it is shockingly ableist. And I was wondering, do you find it's any better or worse in the US when it comes to that sort of train of thought?
Yeah. Well, so first, obviously, like, so that's the same mindset that drove, the eugenics movement of the late 19th century into the 20th century, right? That's the same reasonings that Hitler was using, trying to somehow take out these lesser qualities in the human race to make a more supreme, a better, more perfect human race, right? That's like that same line of thinking of, hey, they're going to have these disabilities, and because of that, that's not something we want in our culture, right? I mean, those are just that's modern day eugenics, really, for us, that mindset. And so it's very dangerous, whether we recognize that or not, or will be willing to or not, is very dangerous mindset. It's a very wrong mindset. I think culturally, for where I'm at in the United States, it's really interesting because right now there's a huge movement, I think, for people wanting to care for the little guy, wanting to stand up for those who have disabilities or whatever, or these things that hold them back. Like, there's a big movement towards that, right, in the United States. I think the biggest movement, though, with as far as abortion is concerned, from what I can tell, is it's more so an understanding, or this, it's more so driven out of a belief that we can't tell a woman what to do with her body. That the case of abortion is a woman's rights issue. It's not a human rights issue. It's a woman's rights issue. And really what's happened is we're drawing the line not at ableism, if you will, of like whether or not they have disabilities or not. What we're drawing the line on is like viability or personhood, right? So at what point are they able to survive outside the womb? Should we then care for them? Or at what point are they considered a person with value that we ought to protect, right? So to me, from what I see as far as on states, seems more on that side, but that's really just another, that's all that is just another configuration of this idea that, like, hey, well, they can't take care of themselves. They've got these, things, that's making them dependent upon others. So why would we care for them up until this point, right? So really, that same thinking in the sense of like, okay, this person is going to be born with these disabilities. They're going to be relying on somebody else for the rest of their life. So let's just make it easy and get rid of them and don't let them start their life outside the womb to begin with. That's really the same mindset, just on, just in a different, a different configuration.
A lot of abortion supporters would say that you are not really an abortion survivor, that that term is somewhat of an oxymoron because you weren't you when the abortion attempt happened. You were a clump of cells, or you were too small to even be human. How would you respond to this absurd claim, if you even wanted to dignify it with a response?
Yes, I mean, so in the States, when it started, this abortion movement, the pro-choice movement, when all that started, that was the mantra. It's just a clump of cells, right? The technology wasn't necessarily there as much, but now with technology, with ultrasound capability, the way science has moved, like, it is impossible to, like, look at an ultrasound and go, oh, clump of cells, right? And so that argument, like, is more so, I would say, dying in the sense of just a clump of cells. But the argument's still there in the sense of it's going, okay, so at what point do we start caring about this human life, right? And And we see this all throughout the states right now. This that everybody's drawing arbitrary lines here and there on, okay, at what point does it stop being just whatever it's going to be, and it becomes a human being that we care about and that we ought to protect, right? And so everybody's choosing all these different arbitrary lines, and in the last handful of years we've seen really crazy things happen because of that. We've seen, you know, we've had governors, you know, in the last handful of years, we've had governors who say, you know, once the baby's born, a discussion would be had between the doctor and the mother whether or not they want to keep the baby or not, right? And at that point, we had a lot of people, you know, in our country going, "Wait, once the baby's been born, what? How does that work out, right?" But then we just go, "Okay, well, what about 5 minutes before they're born? What about 10 minutes before? An hour, a week, a month?" Right? And they just keep drawing these arbitrary lines of like, okay, so at what point do we decide they're not just a clump of cells, if you will, or not just a fetus or whatever, but actually somebody that we should care about and assign value to as a human being? And so people choose birth, people choose, you know, second trimester, people choose viability, people choose all these different lines where we draw them at. And what's in reality is, as we consider science, really the only objective line we can really draw that at is at conception.
Yeah.
And that reality, that at conception, we have a new, distinct human being who ought to be protected, ought to be cared for, and ought to be given the same right to life that we give everybody else outside of the womb. And so we always just, I think, need to drive it back to that reality. Like at conception, we've got a new human being. And if we're going to say we care about human beings, that human beings ought to be valued, they ought to be protected, they ought to be given a right to life, then that starts at conception.
Yeah, it's very straightforward and quite easy to grasp, because even if you look at the pro-choice argument of a woman's right and a woman's bodily autonomy, if you ask them, okay, when does the woman's bodily autonomy stop, or is it absolute? They would say, oh, it's absolute. Then I'd say, well, why should you not be able to have an abortion the day before you're due? Because really, when you sit down with people who support abortion, it's very hard to get a straight answer out of them in terms of that. They often have a sort of a visceral reaction to that, because of course nobody could, well, you would hope, nobody could support abortion so close to birth. It's much harder to make the baby out to be a clump of cells. But you're right, you really have to come down to life begins at conception. That is a separate human being, and there is no woman's bodily autonomy, it is the baby's bodily autonomy. The baby is a separate human being with their separate body. Well, Josiah, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. We really appreciate you speaking out and sharing your story. It can't be easy, but thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you. God bless.